There are 3 rules every mountain biker knows. Wear a helmet, look where you want to go, and never, ever ride alone on an unsanctioned trail. We broke that last rule. All 4 of us, me, Liam, Chloe, and Ben. We were experienced, maybe a little arrogant, and we were chasing a legend. An old logging trail called the Widowmaker, a mythical 20-mile downhill run somewhere deep in the national forest that was rumored to be the ride of a lifetime. The kind of trail you earn bragging rights on forever. We found the trailhead after 2 hours of poring over old topographical maps. It wasn't much, just a faint break in the trees, almost completely swallowed by the forest. The air instantly grew cooler as we passed into the shade of the ancient pines. The first few miles were incredible, everything the legend promised. The trail was a perfect, narrow ribbon of dirt snaking through the trees, a roller coaster of dips and climbs that made you feel alive. We were laughing, shouting to each other, our tires humming over the packed earth. The deeper we went, though, the quieter the forest became. The bird song faded, the squirrels vanished. There was just the sound of our own breathing and the crunch of our wheels. The world felt like it was holding its breath. Liam was in the lead, whooping as he cleared a small jump when it happened. He didn't just crash, he was thrown. A sharp, metallic zing cut through the air, followed by his yell as his bike was violently ripped sideways, sending him flying hard into a thicket of ferns. We rushed to him. He was clutching his leg, his face pale with pain and shock. A thin, almost invisible monofilament wire had been strung between 2 trees, about 6 inches off the ground. It was a snare trap, and it had caught his front wheel perfectly. Luckily, his momentum had snapped the wire, but not before it had bent his front rim into a useless, mangled pretzel. His ride was over. "What the hell is this?" Chloe asked, her voice shaky as she pointed at the glittering wire. "Is this for poachers?" "The wire is too thin for a deer," Ben said, his voice grim as he examined the frayed ends. "This would just injure it. This feels meaner." We all looked around, the beautiful forest suddenly feeling hostile. We had no choice but to keep going. It was shorter to finish the trail than to hike all the way back up. Ben, ever the pragmatist, took Liam's useless bike to walk it down, and we continued, much slower now, our initial adrenaline replaced with annoying, cold unease. The traps got worse. A few miles later, I was navigating a fast, flowing section when I saw a flicker of movement ahead. A log, suspended by a vine, was swinging down directly towards me like a pendulum. I slammed on my brakes, my back tire skidding out as I went down hard. The log, heavy and thick as my thigh, swung past my head with a sickening whoosh, missing me by inches before crashing into a tree. It was a deadfall trap, rigged with a tripwire I had somehow missed. This wasn't for poaching. This was for killing people. The forest, which had felt wild and beautiful an hour ago, now felt malicious and intelligent. Every shadow seemed to hide a threat. We started calling out warnings constantly. "What's your left?" low branch. No, wait, that's another wire. We began seeing things in the periphery, a flicker of movement, a shape that was too dark in the dappled sunlight. We tried our phones. No signal. Not a single bar. We were completely on our own. The third type of trap was the one that broke us. We were in a steep, rocky section, forced to get off and walk our bikes. Chloe stepped around a fallen log to find a better footing. A patch of leaves under her foot gave way with a wet, tearing sound, and she screamed, a roar, agonized sound that echoed through the silent trees. Her foot had plunged into a shallow pit, carefully disguised with a flimsy covering of branches and leaves. At the bottom, a dozen sharpened sticks, fire-hardened and angled upwards, were waiting. One of them had gone clean through the thick rubber sole of her riding shoe and deep into the arch of her foot. The pain was immense, but it was the calculated, vicious cruelty of it that shattered our nerve. A punji pit. A trap from a war movie sitting in the middle of a forest in North America. This wasn't a random act. This was a dedicated effort. Someone had spent days, maybe weeks, turning this forest into their own personal hunting ground. We were miles from civilization, with no signal and 2 injured friends. Chloe couldn't walk, let alone ride. Ben and I, our hands shaking with adrenaline, fashioned a makeshift splint and stretcher out of branches and our own jackets. Every step carrying her was agonizing. Liam, his own face tight with pain, limped behind us, dragging the 2 useless bikes. The forest was no longer silent. We could hear things now. A twig snapping just out of sight. A low whistle that seemed to move through the trees around us. We felt hunted. We kept looking back over our shoulders, half expecting to see a figure in the trees, watching us, disappointed that their traps had only wounded, not killed. We finally stumbled out of the forest onto a gravel fire road just as the sun was setting, a miserable, terrified group of 4. The sense of relief was so overwhelming it almost brought me to my knees. We were out. By some miracle, Ben's phone got a single, flickering bar of service. He managed to call 911, his voice cracking as he tried to explain our location. It took them over an hour to find us. They airlifted Chloe out, and the rest of us were met by sheriff's deputies who listened to our story with grim, tight-lipped expressions. We never found out who set those traps. The official report called it malicious vandalism, but we knew what it really was. It was a warning. A few weeks later, I was talking to an old park ranger about what happened. He just shook his head slowly. "You kids were lucky," he said, his voice low. "You're not the first. That whole section of the forest, it's got a history. A long time ago, a lot of people started going up there, are hikers, bikers mostly, and just never came back down. No bodies, no gear, nothing. They just vanished. People around here stopped going. They say the Widowmaker Trail wasn't named for its difficulty. They say it was named for what it does to you if you're not welcome." It was supposed to be a digital detox weekend, a phrase my friend Sarah had thrown around with the earnestness of a true believer. The four of us, me, Sarah, her boyfriend Mark, and my cousin, Jess, were going to hike a remote section of the Appalachian Trail, a part so isolated it wasn't even on most of the popular trail apps. No phones, no GPS, just us and the wilderness, Sarah had said, romanticizing the idea of being truly untethered. The first day was idyllic. The autumn air was crisp, the foliage was a riot of red and gold, and the only sounds were the crunch of our boots on the fallen leaves and our own easy laughter. We made camp that evening in a small, natural clearing, feeling smugly disconnected from the world. It was that night, just as we were about to douse the campfire, that Jess pointed into the trees, her voice a tight whisper. "What's that?" Hanging from a low-hanging branch of a hemlock tree, just at the edge of the firelight, was a small bundle of sticks and twine. It was crudely fashioned into the shape of a person, with a single, greasy black crow's feather tied to its head. "It's just one of those Blair Witch things," Mark said with a nervous laugh, trying to project a confidence none of us felt. "Probably some college kids trying to be spooky." He walked over, snapped the branch with a loud crack, and tossed the doll into the dying embers of the fire. It smoked and hissed, and for a moment, the twine figure seemed to curl in on itself, as if in agony, before catching fire. We all went to our tents that night feeling a little less at ease, the acrid smell of the burning effigy still hanging in the cold air. The next morning, the strangeness continued, escalating with a quiet, methodical menace. We found the first marking about a mile into our hike. It was painted on a large, flat rock in what was unmistakably dried blood, its color a dark, rusty brown. It was a simple symbol, a spiral with 3 straight lines radiating out from the center. It was oddly compelling, and we all stopped to stare at it, a silent dread beginning to settle over our group. A few hundred yards later, we found another one, this time carved deep into the bark of a massive oak tree. And then another, painted on a fallen log. They were everywhere, always just in view of the trail, like silent, cryptic signposts leading us deeper into a place we didn't belong. With each one we passed, the cheerful chatter of our group grew quieter. The feeling of being in a pristine wilderness was gone, replaced by the unsettling sensation that we were walking through someone else's territory. Someone who wanted us to know they were there. Then we started finding the dolls again. They weren't just hanging from branches anymore. One was placed in the hollow of a tree, its stick arms reaching out as if in supplication. Another was half buried in the trail itself, forcing us to step over it. Each one was slightly different, more personal. One had a scrap of faded red flannel tied to it. Another had a small, smooth river stone where its heart should be. They felt less like jokes and more like offerings. Or warnings. The forest itself seemed to be growing sick. We passed a deer hanging upside down from a high branch, its throat slit, its blood still dripping slowly onto the leaves below. A little further on, we saw the severed heads of an elk and a bear, impaled on sharpened stakes on either side of the trail, their dead eyes seeming to watch us pass. The air grew thick with a coppery smell of decay. We should have turned back. I know that now. But we were caught in that foolish hiker's logic. We had a destination, a planned campsite, and turning back felt like admitting defeat, like letting the fear win. We reached the clearing for a second night's camp just before dusk. It was a beautiful spot on a bluff overlooking a valley. But we weren't the first ones there. In the center of the clearing stood a dozen of the stick figures, each one impaled on a sharpened stake and arranged in a perfect circle. They weren't dolls anymore. They were effigies, each one adorned with tufts of animal fur, teeth, and more of those black crow feathers. In the center of the circle was a flat, dark stone, slick and still wet with fresh blood. The spiral symbol was painted on it, gleaming in the dying light. That's when we heard it. A sound, faint at first, drifting up from the valley below on the evening mist. It was a low, monotonous chanting. It wasn't one voice, but several, rising and falling in a strange, discordant rhythm. It wasn't in English or any language we could recognize. It was guttural, ancient, and filled with a sorrow so profound it made the hairs on my arms stand up. It was the sound of a ritual. We didn't even speak. We looked at each other, our faces pale masks of terror in the fading light, and we ran. We abandoned our heavy packs, grabbing only water and flashlights, and we crashed back through the woods, away from the chanting, away from the silent, watching saints of the trail. The blood-red symbols on the trees seemed to glow in the beams of our flashlights as we passed them, mocking our retreat. We hiked through the entire night, fueled by pure adrenaline and the horrifying sounds of the forest, which now seemed alive with whispers and movement just beyond our sight. When we finally stumbled out of the forest and onto a paved road at dawn, we were exhausted, scratched up, and utterly broken. We never talked about what we saw. There was no way to explain it that didn't sound insane. But sometimes, when I'm in a place that's too quiet, I can still hear it in the back of my mind. That low, mournful chanting, drifting up from a place that doesn't belong on any map, a place where the old gods still demand their tribute in blood and bone. My friends and I were adherents to the ultralight backpacking philosophy, a creed that elevates minimalism to a high art. We believed we could outsmart nature with superior gear and intellect, carrying only gossamer-thin tarps, the bare minimum of calorie-dense food, and an abundance of hubris. We were attempting a challenging 50-mile loop through the Razorback Wilderness, a notoriously rugged and remote expanse of serrated canyons and dense, thorny chaparral. The initial 2 days were an exercise in punishing but rewarding austerity. The severe, arid landscape possessed a brutal, sun-bleached beauty. The trouble began on the 3rd morning. We awoke in our secluded canyon campsite to find my friend Dana's food bag had vanished. We had all secured our provisions high on a sheer, inaccessible rock face, the proper method. Yet hers was gone. The rope remained, dangling limply from its anchor, its end meticulously frayed, as if methodically gnawed through by a multitude of tiny, razor-sharp teeth. "It has to be a congress of rock squirrels," I proposed, the word sounding hollow even to me. "A whole colony of them." But none of our other bags, suspended mere feet away, showed any sign of disturbance. A cold knot of genuine dread began to coalesce in my stomach. We divided our remaining food with her, but our own carefully calculated rations were now critically low. That night, my own food bag was the one to disappear. The execution was identical, the rope severed, the bag spirited away without a sound. An unsettling quiet had fallen over our group. This was not the work of opportunistic animals. This was intelligent, a deliberate and silent campaign of attrition. We were deep in an unforgiving wilderness, a 2-day hike from the nearest road, and our sustenance was being systematically dismantled. The 4th day was a waking feeble dream. We were all enfeebled, the gnawing hunger painting every dancing shadow in the canyon with a menacing brush. That afternoon, we found the first piece of evidence. It was Dana's food bag, eviscerated, its contents strewn across the dry, cracked earth of the creek bed. The food hadn't been consumed. The granola bars were pulverized into fine dust, the dehydrated meals ripped open and desecrated with a strange, dark, oleaginous slime that emitted a profoundly foul odor. Something had pilfered the bag, obliterated the food, and displayed it for us to find. It wasn't trying to eat. It was conducting psychological warfare, attempting to starve us into submission. That's when we discovered the skeleton. Tucked away beneath a sandstone overhang, not far from Dana's ruined provisions, were the mortal remains of another hiker. The bones were ancient, bleached a stark, porcelain white by the relentless sun. The chilling detail was the backpack beside them, its fabric shredded, with a skeletal hand still wrapped in a death grip around a rusty, empty can of beans. They had perished from starvation, ensnared in the very same predicament we now faced. We were seized by a primal, unreasoning fear. We were being hunted, but not in any way we comprehended. "We are not finishing this loop," my friend Mike declared, his voice a low, guttural growl. "We're retreating. We know that terrain. We're not walking blind into another unknown." The decision catalyzed a change within us. The fear was still a palpable entity, but it was now alloyed with a cold, hard rage. We were no longer passive victims. We would fight back. We dedicated the next hour to arming ourselves. We disassembled our expensive carbon fiber trekking poles and used lengths of paracord to lash our titanium sporks and serrated tent stakes to the ends, fashioning crude, almost pathetic-looking pipes. Mike discovered a shard of corroded sheet metal near the skeleton's camp and spent 20 minutes laboriously honing its edge on a whetstone until it was a wicked-looking hand axe. We had ceased to be hikers. We were now a grim cadre of warriors preparing for a siege. That night, we didn't owe our food. We arranged our last remaining meals in a small pile in the center of our camp and sat back to back around it, our makeshift weapons clutched in our hands, waiting for the inevitable. In the dead of night, they came. I was wrenched from a shallow, fitful sleep by a sound just beyond the perimeter of our camp. It was a soft, wet, inquisitive sniffing, accompanied by a low, chittering vocalization that sounded like a horrifying fusion of a rat and a monkey. Then I heard the sound of something sharp, like a shard of obsidian, being dragged slowly across the surface of the rock, a sound that set my teeth on edge. Mike slowly raised a trembling hand and pointed. In the pale, spectral moonlight, we saw them. They were small, no larger than a bobcat, with pallid, hairless skin that seemed to glow with a faint luminescence. Their bodies were hunched and sinuous, and they possessed long, clawed fingers and faces that were a grotesque amalgamation of a bat and a naked mole rat, with tiny, black, sightless orbs for eyes. There were at least a dozen of them, creeping with an unsettling fluidity down the canyon walls, their heads twitching towards our food. One of them, more audacious than the rest, scurried into our camp. Without a sound, Mike lunged forward and swung his rusted axe. The impact produced a sickeningly wet crunch, followed by a high-pitched squeal that was abruptly cut short. The other creatures instantly became immobile, their chittering ceasing. They turned their sightless faces toward us in perfect, eerie unison. Then, as one, they receded back into the shadows and vanished. At the first pre-dawn hint of light, we were up. We didn't pack properly. We just crammed everything into our bags and began our retreat, half running, our weapons held at the ready. We passed the spot where Dana's bag had been destroyed. The creature Mike had dispatched was gone. There wasn't a single drop of blood on the sand. They had taken their dead with them. We made it out of the wilderness, but only just. We were emaciated, dehydrated, and borderline hypothermic. We recounted our story to the rangers, presenting our crude weapons as evidence. They listened patiently, their faces impassive, and then exchanged a strange, knowing glance. One of them told us that the area had a local name, one not found on any map. They called it the Hungry Place. He said that sometimes the forest just decides it doesn't want you there. But, he added, his gaze lingering on our pathetic spears with something akin to respect, it sounds like you were the first ones in a very long time who decided to fight back.